Here is Sailor Studio 464. This is a cool water at the beach kind of turquoise that is a bit lighter in the writing sample than in the swatch. There is noticeable tone shift as papers change, and it does tend to shade fairly well. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, this performs exceptionally well with no aggression and is a great ink for student note takers. There aren't many turquoise that I want a bottle of, but that is because turquoise just isn't my thing. So I wouldn't want a bottle of this because I don't see myself as wanting to go use it.
The pen for today is a Pilot Vanishing Point. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
A cool, refreshing dip in the pool on a hot Florida day. That is this tone right here. No feather, no spread, very nice shading throughout. You're hard-pressed to find words without shading in it. Relation on the bottom line shows some of the least shading, even though it is there. Look at how the re is lighter than the LA. The TI get a little bit darker. The ON much darker at the end. It can be very same tone, but we frequently get elements of shading in each word. So very nice. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Sailor makes more than one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Sailor.
Here is Sailor Manyo Sakura. Here is Sailor Florida. Here is Sailor Kobe number 27. Here is Sailor Studio 770.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here the tone is a little bit lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. Now it does not feather, does not spread, does shade where you can count the times. You'd probably lose count, but look at count on the fourth line where the COU is lighter than the NT. The amount of shading that's going on is equivalent to what we were seeing on the Clairfontaine, but it is very nice. And it's not leaving you wanting more. It does a great job with standout letters on lighter words. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Here the tone is noticeably lighter and with a slight green lean to it as a turquoise ink, which means the ink we have is a little translucent, being affected by the paper underneath. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does shade very well. You see elements of it everywhere, like element on the second line where the EL is a little bit darker than the E. The E is lighter than the LE that get darker. The M lighten up a little bit, but that ent at the end does work its way a bit darker. Nice shading, nice performance. Just be aware of the color shift. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, this smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread. It does shade not as well as it does on the Clairfontaine, though you can find a much darker spot. For the most part, we go from lighter to mid-tones in the shading. Now, turquoise is something that always worries me when it comes to the quad rule, just because of the tone of the quads that we tend to get. It often, as a color, can sort of meld with it. I do think it's doing a good enough job standing out here from the quad rule. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more teal or turquoise inks.
Here is Caran d'Ache Hypnotic Turquoise. Here is Mont Blanc Blue Hour. Here is Pilot Soyo, or Dew on Pine Tree. Here is Vinta Cayenne Gan.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here the tone is lighter and flatter than we get on the Clairfontaine, a normal effect of this paper. Probably a reason that it's so good for lab use, but that's just what it tends to do with some of the colors. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread, it does shade. Look at how generally dark repetition is here compared to, say, lists on the same line. So it does shade, and it does shade within the same word. Even looking at repetition, we do have lighter tones and darker tones getting a little lighter and darker again. It's there. It's not a standout quality. It does okay here against the quad rule. I think the lighter, flatter version makes it a little visually confusing for me. I would not use this as a student note taker, but I would not count it against a student that did. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Pen BBS number 140. Here is Califolio Aurora. Here is Krishna Brown Pink. Here is Geherban Amber de Bermini.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here the tone is noticeably lighter than it is on the Clairfontaine. It does have tiny feathers, only in a couple of spots. I'm not going to make a to-do out of it. The spread is less than we normally get on Clairfontaine, so I do think that we have a fairly decent ink for this paper. It does tend to shade, which when it does it very well. You can usually see it. Shows some nice darker and lighter tones. Pretty good ink for this paper. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, no over penetration of the ink. An amazing ink for 20-pound copy paper.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The medium flow, medium nib of the Pilot Vanishing Point puts down a cool, refreshing turquoise that shades very well. Off camera, I tried this in a very wet fine. The tone darkened to a level of the swatch, almost full blue, and it did still shade. So if I was to use this, I would want a wet fine or wet medium to see more of the blue. For turquoise lovers, go for a medium flow, fine or medium nib, maybe even really that stub, to keep this cool, refreshing turquoise tone.